I had never left our small town before I turned 25. My parents never took me anywhere, and I never thought much about it until I finally left, realizing just how much I loved the open road. Most truckers will tell you about the strange things they've seen while on the road, creepy encounters, unsettling sights. In my 30 years, I thought I had already seen the worst of it. I was so wrong. I was heading from San Antonio to Dallas after a drop-off at 7 in the morning. I still had a few hours to go when I pulled off at a small diner on the side of I-35. I'd missed lunch, and my bladder was about to burst. I parked my rig in the gravel lot and locked it up, walking toward the entrance. The first thing that struck me was the eerie silence. The diner was completely empty. I'm not talking about a few tables. There was no one. No waiters, no cooks, no customers, nothing. I checked the door to make sure the open sign was still blinking red, and then I headed straight for the bathroom. I thought maybe I could just use the restroom and find a McDonald's at the next exit. But when I walked out, I wasn't alone anymore. Sitting at the bar was an old man. His gray hair was neatly slicked back, and he wore a dark gray suit that fit his slender frame perfectly. He looked to be in his 70s, smoking a cigar. At first, he didn't acknowledge me, but after taking another drag, he glanced over at me, nodded, and patted the stool beside him. He gestured for me to sit down. I hesitated, unsure, but he didn't seem dangerous, so I walked over and sat down. I looked around again, still no one. "Can I get you a drink?" he asked in a voice rough from years of chain-smoking. "Just water," I replied. For a few moments, he studied me, his dark, wrinkled eyes scanning my face, lingering a little too long. Then, he stood up slowly, leaning on a cane. As he shuffled to the sink, he glanced back at me. "We don't get many customers here," he said, filling a glass of water. He set the glass in front of me and leaned over the bar, watching me intently. "You work here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. The man chuckled softly. "Zorda Hova, I own it." I nodded, looking around once more. "How long have you been here?" "As long as I can remember." His answer was strange, but I didn't press it. "You hungry?" he asked, standing up straight. I was starving. "Yeah, I could go for a burger or something." He nodded and disappeared into the back. When he returned, he set the juiciest burger I'd ever seen in front of me, perfectly cooked, with all the fixings. He gently slid it toward me, then slowly made his way back around the bar to sit beside me. I dug in, realizing just how hungry I really was. The man watched me, his eyes never leaving me. After a few moments, he spoke again. "What's your name?" I swallowed a bite of my burger, glancing at him. "Steve," I said quickly. He nodded, taking a drag from his cigarette. "I'm Nick." He pulled another cigarette from his suit pocket and lit it. He offered it to me, but I politely declined. I finished my meal, savoring the last bite. "Thanks for the dinner," I said. "It was delicious. What do I owe you?" Nick stood up, smirking. "People who come here, they want more than just a meal." I stood up, unsure of how to respond to that. His words lingered in the air, heavy with something unspoken. Nick walked toward the entrance, his back to me. He paused, looking over his shoulder. "Food is not what you truly desire tonight." I stared at Nick for a few seconds, trying to figure out if he was joking or if he was just completely out of his mind. His grin never wavered, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I shoved a tip onto the table and made my way to the door, brushing past him as I pushed it open. The cold air hit me as I stepped outside, my heart racing, desperate to get away from that place. I didn't look back, but as I walked toward my truck, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me. When I climbed into the cab and started the engine, I glanced at the diner through the rearview mirror. Nick was still standing at the entrance, grinning that wide, unsettling grin. I sped off, relieved to be leaving that strange place and its unnerving owner behind. But Nick. He stayed with me, lingering in my thoughts. His grin burned into my mind for the rest of the night. The road stretched on for miles. Nothing but empty stretches of highway. After an hour, I realized something strange. I hadn't seen a single building except for that diner. And then, just when I thought I couldn't hold it any longer, I saw another diner up ahead. My bladder screamed for relief, so I pulled in, desperate to get inside. The moment I walked through the door, I froze. It was the same diner, the same place. Nick was there, sitting at the bar, his gray hair unmistakable. He turned toward me, his smile too wide, too knowing. Well, nice to have you back, Steve, he said, his voice smooth and unsettling. I stood frozen, part of me terrified, the other part furious. What the hell do you want from me? I yelled, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. How did you do this? Nick stood slowly, using his cane to steady himself, and took his time walking toward me. It's what you want, not me, he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. He gestured to a nearby booth. I didn't want to sit, but something about his presence made it feel like I didn't have a choice. I reluctantly slid into the booth across from him. So, Steve, he began, his eyes never leaving mine. Tell me a little bit about yourself. I was beyond frustrated, my mind racing. I don't have time for this. Bite me, I snapped, nearly spinning away from him. Nick just chuckled softly, unfazed. Steve, he muttered, shaking his head like he was talking to a child. He looked up at me, his dark eyes meeting mine, and I felt something cold wash over me. His eyes weren't just brown, they were so dark, they looked black in the dim light of the diner. Don't be so hostile, he said, his voice almost soothing. I'm trying to help you. I studied his face, trying to find some sign that this was all a joke. Maybe some hidden cameras would pop out, and I'd realize I was on some twisted prank show. But no, there was nothing. No camera crew, no laughter, just Nick, sitting there with that unreadable expression on his face. I don't understand, I said softly, my anger starting to fade into confusion. What do you want from me? Nick leaned back in the booth, studying me for a moment before he spoke again. There's something you want, and I can give it to you, my boy. I looked at him, unsure of what he was talking about. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nick's face remained unreadable. Tell me about yourself, Steve. Maybe then it'll all start to make sense. I didn't want to, but something about his words made me feel like I had no choice. I've been a trucker for 30 years, I muttered, my voice distant. Nick nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. And why do you drive? He asked, his tone almost casual. I stared at the table, unsure how to respond. I like driving, I said, but the words felt hollow. Nick studied me for a moment, then shrugged. You like driving? Huh? Are you like Ronnie? I frowned, confused. What's that supposed to mean? Nick just shrugged again, folding his arms over his chest. Exactly what I said. I glanced out the window, trying to collect my thoughts. The road outside was empty, just like before. But when I turned back to Nick, he cleared his throat, pulling my attention back to him. What happened before you became a trucker, Steve? He asked, his voice low, almost to calm. I looked down at the table, unable to meet his gaze. I had a family, I whispered, a wife. A daughter. Nick smiled smugly, his eyes gleaming with something dark. A beautiful daughter. Right. I snapped my head up, my heart racing. How do you know that? I demanded. Nick's smile widened, and he leaned in, his voice soft and almost conspiratorial. I know everything, Steve, everything. My mind spun, my anger rising again. Then why ask? I snapped, my fists clenchying. Nick's grin never faltered. Because you're about to learn what you really want, you have to be the one to say it, Nick said, his voice cold and knowing. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. Yeah, I had a wife ... and a daughter, but they're gone now. And they've been gone for a really long time. Nick nodded slowly, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table. What happened to them, Steve? His voice was too calm, too measured. They're dead, I muttered, barely above a whisper. A fire. Nick didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. He watched me for a few long moments, his eyes dark and unreadable. I'm very sorry to hear that, Steve, he said, his tone almost sincere. It was the kind of sympathy that made my skin crawl. I nodded quietly, feeling the room close and around me. I don't mean to be a buzzkill, Nick suddenly interrupted, breaking the silence with a sharp edge to his voice. But nice people don't end up in my diner. I looked up at him, confused. What? Nick folded his arms across his chest, his smile creeping wider. What really happened that night, Steve? I shook my head, my frustration mounting. I already told you. It was a fire. Faulty wiring. Nick nodded, his eyes narrowing. For the first time, I could see the wheels turning in his head, as if he was piecing something together. You don't believe that, he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Of course I do, I snapped, my patience thinning. Nick chuckled darkly, his gaze never leaving mine. But we both know that wasn't really what caused the fire. He leaned in close, his breath hot on my face. We both know it was a coincidence that saved her ass. His laugh sent a shiver down my spine. Did the faulty wires pass by a lit cigarette too? I stood up, shoving the table hard, the metal scraping against the floor. What are you insinuating? I yelled, my fists clenched at my sides. I was inches from his face now, my anger boiling over. Nick didn't flinch, he just sat there, calm as ever. It was a drunken mistake, Steve, he said, his voice unbothered. I stepped back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Who are you? I demanded. Nick laughed, a low, unsettling chuckle that made my blood run cold. If I told you, you'd never believe me. I let go of his shirt collar, my hands trembling, and picked up his cane for him. Straightening, I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. What is it that you want? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Nick looked at me, his eyes glinting with something dark. I already told you. It's about what you want. I stared at him, searching for any hint of deception, but there was nothing. He was telling the truth, or at least, his version of it. I sat back down, my mind racing. I sighed deeply, my hands trembling. The tears started to well up, and I couldn't stop them. I want them back, I choked out, my voice cracking. Nick was silent for a long moment, watching me with those dark eyes of his. Then, he spoke, his voice smooth and cold. I can do that. I looked up at him, the tears now flowing freely down my face. That's not funny. Nick's smile didn't waver. Who said I was joking? I stood up again, my fists clenched. Don't mess with me, old man, I warned, my voice low and dangerous. Nick raised his hands defensively, but the smile never left his face. I'm not messing with you, Steve. I can give them back to you. But there's a price. I locked eyes with him, my anger mixing with confusion. A price. Nick chuckled quietly, leaning back in his seat. Well, Steve ... all I want from you is your soul. I stared at him, incredulous. My soul. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What are you? Insane? Nick didn't even blink. After you die, of course, he said, making sure I understood the terms. I'll come to collect it in 30 years. I laughed loudly, the sound harsh and bitter. You, 30 more years. You look like you could drop dead in the next 30 minutes. Nick's smile didn't fade. If you agree to give me your soul after you die, I'll bring your wife and daughter back from the dead. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was this some kind of twisted joke? Was I dreaming? Or, Had I somehow stumbled into a nightmare? Exactly, Nick said, his voice flat and final. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling. What kind of drugs are you on? Nick leaned back in his chair, his grin widening. The kind that make people like you desperate enough to ask for what they can't have. I'm the devil, Nick said, far more casually than I could have ever expected. His voice had that unnerving calmness, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stared at him, my mind racing. So, you're the devil, and you want my soul? I asked, the words tasting like poison as they left my mouth. Nick simply shrugged, his grin widening. Yeah, I'll need it after you die, he said, as if it were just another part of the deal. I laughed, though it was hollow and forced. If I agree to this ... will you let me go? I just want to go home. I needed to humor him, play along, just to get out of that nightmare. I was hoping that once I left, I'd never have to think about this strange, twisted night again. Nick nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. You won't see me for another 30 years. I shook his hand, the warmth of his grip shocking me. It was far hotter than I expected, like a furnace. I quickly yanked my hand back, but when I looked at it, it was red, burned as if I'd touched a flame. But when I looked back up, Nick was gone. Not just him, the entire diner was gone. The place had vanished, leaving only a small, empty field around me. My truck was parked 100 yards away, sitting on the side of the road like it had always been there. I looked around, but there was nothing. No diner, no Nick, just the oppressive silence of the night. I jogged back to my rig, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop again. I couldn't. I had to get home, had to escape. Whatever the hell had just happened. I drove straight through, not daring to take my eyes off the road. I made it home by midnight, impossible, considering the drive should have taken for hours, and I'd spent at least 2 of those in that cursed diner. It should have been around 3 or 4 in the morning, but it felt like I'd never stopped at all. When I stepped inside, the house was dark, eerily quiet. I flipped the light switch, kicking off my boots. Then I heard it. Steve, is that you? Sweetheart. I froze. That voice. It couldn't be. But it was. It was Christina's voice. My Christina, the one I had lost all those years ago. I heard the patter of little feet scampering across the floor upstairs. Daddy. This was impossible. My little girl, the one who had died in that fire when she was just 7, the one I had failed, the one I blamed myself for every single day. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, trying to wrap my mind around it. Was it possible? Had Nick really been telling the truth? Was he really the devil? Had I truly sold my soul? It didn't matter now, though. I had 30 years. 30 years before I had to pay the price. 30 years to spend with my family. I heard the footsteps coming down the stairs, and that's when I realized something was horribly, terribly wrong. As they emerged from the shadows, I saw them, my wife, my daughter, but they weren't right. They were wrong. Their skin was blackened, charred, peeling off in chunks. Their clothes were melted into their skin, fused together in a grotesque display of burned flesh. And their eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared at me with a kind of dead knowledge. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. They were dead. They had been dead for 30 years. Nick had tricked me. He had given me what I wanted, but it was a lie. He was a trickster. He was the devil. And he had brought them back, but not as I remembered them, not as the people I loved. They were a mockery of the life I once had, a constant, rotting reminder of my sins. I looked at them, the bile rising in my throat, and I realized the worst thing of all. I had sold my soul for this, and I knew. I knew exactly how he was going to kill me. 30 years. 30 years with them, these twisted, decaying versions of my family. 30 years of torment, of watching them fall apart, of feeling the weight of my mistake. I might as well take the smoke detectors down now.